A man, a decade of silence, a past that cannot be erased. Walter Hartman, an elderly man marked by mistakes and regrets, lives isolated in an empty routine until devastating news turns his life upside down. With time running out, he sets out on one final journey, to cross the country and confront the son he hasn't spoken to in 10 years. On one side, the fear of rejection. On the other, a chance at redemption. In this story of second chances, Walter discovers that even the most broken relationships can find a way back. But has he arrived in time? The clock on the wall read 7:15 a.m., but for Walter Hartman, the hours no longer held the same weight. He had been awake since before dawn, sitting in his favorite armchair in the living room, staring at a glass of cheap whiskey resting on the coffee table. It wasn't usual for him to drink so early, but that morning was different. The worn envelope in his trembling hand held a photo of David, his son, only 8 years old, smiling next to a new bicycle. The photograph, taken during a distant summer, was the only thing left of a relationship he had helped destroy. 10 years had passed since his last conversation with David, a heated argument that started over something trivial and ended with slammed doors and absolute silence. Walter had convinced himself that he was in the right at the time. He was the father. David should have come after him, not the other way around. But now, time was working against him. The diagnosis he had received the previous week was clear and unforgiving: stage 4 lung cancer. The doctor had mentioned palliative care, but Walter barely listened. The weight of the words "limited time" crushed everything else that could have been said. At that moment, staring at the photo, he made a decision. The idea terrified him, but staying there, waiting to die alone, seemed far worse. He would go see David. He didn't know what awaited him in Oregon. He might be rejected, ignored, or, worse, realize that his son had moved on without even thinking of him. Still, something inside him insisted that he had to try. 2 days later, Walter was packing his car. The old Buick was crammed with junk accumulated over the years, most of it useless. He spent hours trying to organize the trunk, as if arranging the luggage was more important than the journey itself. Every movement was slow, almost painful, and the thought of giving up arose with every small obstacle. It was already nighttime when he finally finished, sitting in the driver's seat with the engine running. The street was empty, except for the distant sound of a barking dog. Walter looked at the small, weathered house he had paid for with so much effort over the years. It was all he had. The idea of leaving it behind, even for a short time, seemed absurd. "This is crazy," he muttered to himself. Walter hesitated many times. He was apprehensive, afraid. Yet, after several attempts, he finally mustered the courage and hit the road, not looking back. The first hours of the trip were uncomfortable. Walter had the persistent feeling that something could go wrong at any moment. The car breaking down, his health failing, or simply losing his nerve again. The solitude of the road didn't help. It was just him, the miles ahead, and the thoughts piling up in his mind. Why had he taken so long? Why had he never called? Why had he let pride take over? Walter reached Oregon on a cold, gray afternoon. After days on the road, his body was exhausted, but the tension in his mind was even heavier. He drove slowly through the quiet streets of the town, David's address etched in his memory and written on a worn piece of paper resting on the passenger seat. When he finally saw the house, a cozy 2-story home with windows glowing in the fading daylight, his heart raced. The garden was well kept, with winter flowers bravely enduring the chill. Everything seemed too peaceful, as if the place existed in a world far removed from the turmoil inside his mind. Walter parked the car across the street, turning off the engine slowly. He sat in silence, staring at the house. He saw a shadow pass by one of the windows, perhaps David, or maybe someone he didn't know. Time seemed to freeze there. He gripped the steering wheel with both hands, his fingers tightening. That small gesture, getting out of the car, crossing the street, and knocking on the door, felt like the most impossible thing in the world. "He doesn't want to see me," Walter muttered to himself, his voice hoarse and heavy with doubt. For endless minutes, Walter sat there, his breathing fast and his chest tight. Every time he thought about stepping out of the car, his mind told him it wasn't worth it. that David wouldn't answer, that maybe he wasn't even home. The exhaustion from the trip finally won, and Walter turned the engine back on. He drove to a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, where he rented a small, dimly lit room. He tossed his bag into a corner and collapsed onto the bed without even changing his clothes. That night, he couldn't sleep. The ceiling of the room seemed to stare back at him, and every shadow on the walls brought memories of his son. He turned from side to side, trying to convince himself that he had done the right thing by not knocking on the door. It's better this way, he thought. If he wanted to see me, he would have come after me. But he knew that wasn't true. The next morning, Walter woke up early, his eyes sunken and weary. Hesitation still clung to him like a shadow, but something within him, maybe guilt, maybe hope, pushed him to get up and splash cold water on his face in the bathroom sink. He looked at himself in the mirror and saw a broken man, but not a defeated one. He grabbed his car keys and drove back to David's house. This time, he parked directly in the driveway. He took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. The chill of the morning air wrapped around him, but he didn't retreat. He climbed the steps with hesitant strides, stopping in front of the door. His hand rose to knock, but froze midair. Walter closed his eyes and drew a deep breath. Now or never, he whispered, feeling the weight of a decade of pain and silence on his shoulders. Then he knocked, his trembling knuckles making a sound almost imperceptible in the stillness of the neighborhood. He stood there, motionless, his heart racing and his thoughts clouded. And then, the door opened. David stood in the doorway, taller and more robust than Walter remembered, but with the same piercing eyes as always. For a moment, the two just stared at each other. Walter tried to speak, but the words seemed stuck in his throat. Finally, his voice came out, hesitant and laden with emotion. David. David's eyes widened, completely stunned. It wasn't anger or joy. It was pure surprise, mixed with years of unanswered questions. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. That was when a child's voice broke the silence. Who is he, Daddy? Walter looked down and saw a boy about 5 years old, with light brown hair and the same eyes as David. The boy held a toy car in his hand and stared at Walter curiously. Walter wanted to respond, but the moment's emotion hit him like a wave. He felt his head spin, his legs buckle, and then everything went dark. He simply fainted. When Walter opened his eyes again, the soft glow of a bedside lamp illuminated the ceiling above him. He smelled clean sheets and realized he was lying in a comfortable bed. For a moment, he thought he was still at some random motel until his vision cleared, and he saw David sitting beside him, arms crossed, his expression closed but not hostile. Walter blinked slowly, confused. Where am I? I don't want to take anyone's room, David. I'm staying at an inn. David leaned forward, and the seemingly insurmountable barrier of 10 years began to crumble. His voice, finally audible, was calm but firm. You're where you're supposed to be, Dad. He paused, looking directly at Walter. This room, it's your room. It's been waiting for you for 10 years. Walter couldn't respond immediately. David's words hit him hard, breaking down the wall of pride he had built over the years. He looked around, noticing the details. A chair by the window, an old clock on the bedside table, and even a framed photograph of him and David, taken decades ago, sitting on a shelf. Walter's throat tightened, and he stammered, You were waiting for me? David nodded, his eyes glinting with a mix of emotions. I always was, Dad. I just didn't know how to bring you back. Walter felt the hot tears stream down his face, but didn't try to hide them. After everything, here was the chance he never thought he would have. Walter sat up slowly on the bed, his movements heavy as if a decade's worth of pain and silence still weighed on his shoulders. He looked at David, who remained by his side, watching him with a mixture of caution and tenderness. Why didn't you ever look for me? Walter asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. David glanced away for a moment, as though arranging his thoughts. Finally, he replied, I tried. For years. I called a few times, but you never answered. After a while, I didn't know what to say anymore. And you didn't try either, Dad. The words, though not spoken with resentment, hit Walter like a blow. He knew they were true. For years, his pride had kept him away, crafting excuses not to call, not to reach out. I was afraid, Walter finally admitted, the words coming out with difficulty. Afraid you wouldn't want to hear me. Afraid of being rejected. David let out a long sigh, as if those words eased part of the tension between them. He stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the garden. I never stopped wanting to, Dad, he said, turning slowly to face him. But you disappeared, and I had to move on. I got married, had Max. I didn't know how to fit you into this new life. Max, Walter murmured, remembering the curious boy who had called him Grandpa. Just the word felt strange and loaded with meaning. I didn't know I had a grandson. You couldn't have known, David replied, a faint smile appearing at the corner of his lips. But he knows who you are. I've talked about you to him. I always wanted him to meet his grandfather. Walter lowered his head, struggling to contain his emotions. All he had imagined was that David had moved on and forgotten him. But now he saw that his son had kept a place for him in his life. I ruined everything, didn't I? Walter asked, his eyes fixed on the floor. David shook his head and stepped closer. What matters is that we're here now. And we still have time, Dad. It's a start. Walter lifted his gaze, his eyes damp meeting David's. He nodded, unable to find the words. The next morning, the sound of childish laughter and the smell of fresh coffee woke Walter. He blinked, confused, until he remembered where he was. The room, with its simple and cozy decor, was a physical reminder that David had been waiting for him. Slowly, he got up, his joints protesting, and followed the sound of voices to the kitchen. David was there, with Max sitting at the table, piling pancakes onto his plate while chattering excitedly about something. The boy saw Walter first and smiled. "Good morning, Grandpa," Max said, the ease with which he spoke the word filling Walter's chest with unexpected warmth. "Good morning," Walter replied, a timid smile appearing on his face. David turned, and for a moment, father and son simply looked at each other, saying nothing. Then David broke the silence. "I hope you slept well, Dad. We'll need energy for the trip." "Trip?" Walter asked, surprised. David nodded, a small smile forming. "I always knew you'd show up. Maybe not when, but I knew. So I planned something. A place for us to go together when it happened." Walter was speechless, feeling a wave of emotion wash over him. "You planned a trip for me?" "For us," David corrected. "And Max, of course. It's a special place. One I think you'll remember." The trip began a few hours later, with Walter's old car leading the way. David drove his own vehicle, with Max beside him. Their destination was a secluded lake in the mountains, the same one Walter had taken David to when he was a boy. When they arrived, Walter recognized the place immediately. The fresh air, the sound of trees swaying in the breeze, and the shimmer of the lake under the sun transported him back to a simpler time. "I can't believe you remember this place," Walter said, his voice tinged with emotion. "How could I forget? It's where I learned to fish," David replied, opening the trunk to grab some gear. As Max ran along the lake's edge, Walter and David began setting up their fishing rods. That simple act brought back old memories, and slowly, the ice between them began to thaw. That night, while Max slept in a tent, Walter and David sat by a campfire. The silence between them was comfortable, but Walter knew he had to say what had brought him there. He took a deep breath and began. "David, there's a reason I came. It's not just about what happened between us, though that's a big part of it." David looked at him, his expression serious. "What is it, Dad?" Walter hesitated, staring into the fire before finally saying, "I'm sick. Cancer. Terminal." David's face hardened. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if he needed time to process the information before asking, "How long have you known?" "A few weeks," Walter replied, his voice faltering. "I didn't want to come here and drop this on you, but I needed to try. I needed to reconnect before it was too late." David remained silent for a long time, his eyes fixed on the flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but steady. "You didn't need to wait until you were sick to come, Dad. I've always wanted you here." Walter nodded, tears now flowing freely. I know that now. But back then, it felt impossible. David leaned forward, placing a hand on his father's shoulder. Then let's make the most of the time we have. Here, now. Walter looked at him, feeling the weight of guilt slowly lift. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone anymore. The following days at the lake were filled with simple but deeply meaningful moments. Walter taught Max how to fish while David watched with a smile on his face. Father and son reminisced about old stories, laughed at memories, and even shed tears as they talked about what had been lost. When the trip ended, something between them had shifted. The silence that had separated them for so many years was now replaced with words and shared moments. And when they returned home, Walter no longer felt like a stranger. He knew that, finally, he was exactly where he belonged.
Hey, if you've made it this far and are enjoying the story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. It's very important for us to keep going. Now, let's get back to the story.
Walter never returned to his house in Philadelphia. His old car, the one that had brought him there, remained parked outside David's home, a silent testament to a journey he never intended to make again. David insisted that his father stay with him, and Walter, for the first time in a long while, didn't argue. He knew life had given him a second chance. He chose not to pursue aggressive treatment. "I'd rather live with quality, not quantity," he had told David one morning as they sat on the porch, sipping coffee. The months that followed were an unexpected gift. Walter spent his days helping David in the garden, teaching Max simple fishing tricks with an improvised rod, and rediscovering joy in the small things. At night, he and David would talk for hours, sharing memories, and sometimes just sitting in a comfortable silence that spoke volumes. Walter finally understood what it meant to belong. But the inevitable came one spring morning. Walter sat in his favorite armchair, looking out the window as the sun lit up the garden. When David came into the room to offer a cup of tea, he found his father still, yet with a peaceful expression on his face. David knelt beside him, a mix of grief and gratitude washing over him. Max, still too young to fully understand, approached and held his grandfather's hand. "He was happy, wasn't he, Daddy?" Max asked softly. David nodded, tears streaming down his face. "Yes, Max. He was very happy." The funeral was held at the small lake where so many memories had been made. David held Max's hand as they looked at the water reflecting the blue sky. "Your grandfather loved this place," David said, his voice thick with emotion but full of tenderness. "And he loved you. Never forget that." "I won't," Max replied firmly. Walter may have passed on, but he left behind something far greater than any material possession. He left a family united, healed by love and shared time. And while the empty chair on the porch served as a reminder of his absence, it also stood as a symbol of the peace he found at the end of his journey. Walter had lived his final days as fully as possible, surrounded by love, with a heart finally at peace.
Walter's story teaches us something profound about family and time. Sometimes the words we don't say weigh heavier than the ones we choose to speak. Hurt, silence, and pride can push away the people we love most, but it's never too late to try to rebuild what was lost. Walter showed us that family love doesn't have to be perfect to be real, and that time, even when it feels short, can be enough to heal wounds and create memories that last forever. Now, we'd love to hear from you. How did Walter and David's story make you feel? What lessons about family and reconciliation did you take from this journey? How do you see the role of reconnecting in your own life? Leave your rating from 0 to 10 for the story in the comments and share your thoughts on what family means to you. And if this story touched your heart, send it to someone special. We never know when a simple gesture can change everything. Because in the end, family is where we find our greatest challenges and our greatest loves.